So today's question is, how do you coach your franchisees to effectiveness? I know some of you out there, some of my clients are franchise owners. They have a franchise and they franchise out to other people. Small businesses will buy part of the franchise or the franchise, become franchisees. And part of your duty is to, your obligation is to support these people to be successful. And some of you manage franchisees too on the behalf of the franchise owner. So there are a couple of things I know that come up for you. One of them is that you're trying to get them to adopt new business practices that are more in alignment with the franchise. And very often, as I'm sure you're clear, these new business practices are going to serve them a lot better than what they're doing right now. But there's a resistance to change. And because they're very comfortable with what they do right now, even though it may be bleeding money, they're still more comfortable doing that, and they're resistant to making the change. And so, how do you transform that? How do you change that situation? Is what I want to talk about here briefly. And part of the distinction here is, well, part of what will work here is to change your thinking from having a convincing conversation. A conversation to try to convince them to do something, which usually doesn't work very well, to what I call a coaching conversation, which is very different. A coaching conversation is not necessarily trying to convince somebody to do something, although sometimes it could be in extreme situations. But most of the time, a coaching conversation is not about convincing people. It's about leading or inviting them somewhere. In fact, the word coach comes from an old German word meant to pull along. As in the German universities, they had a coach, that would invite the student along to learn more, to challenge himself more, so that he's not too bored and he's not too anxious. A good coach will just leave the person right at the correct spot. So there's a lot of reasons for the comfort level, why people don't want to change. They're comfortable with what they have now. So to make a change may involve more work, more time, more energy. And our brains have evolved to look for the most economical way to do things, which sometimes may be to avoid doing something. But we're also intelligent enough to know that, or when we need to do something, because, by expending some effort, if we make more money or greater satisfaction, and if you can show them that that's what's going to happen, then that's a more interesting conversation to have. That's called pulling people along by attracting them to the longer term joy that's available, but being truthful and realistic and saying, there's going to be some short-term suffering going on to make those changes. And you got to ask them at some point, which do you prefer? Long-term suffering, continuing doing the same thing, but having some short spurts of joy because you're comfortable? Or long-term joy with some short spurts of suffering in the short term, but in the long term having more joy? Which would you prefer? Well, if you want long-term joy, you got to start changing some things a little bit. Now, part of the trick is, and what I've seen a lot of franchise managers do, is they try to press too much at one time. They give them a long list of things that they have to change. And if I were a business owner and I looked at that list, I would want to commit harakiri there. I wouldn't, but you get the point. It's just scary to look at that long list. Oh my God, it's like humongous. And not only is it a list, it's a list from someone else that's telling you to do something that's going to change your entire business, right? So it doesn't quite work very well. The first thing to do in coaching people is to gauge their current level of performance. If they can only handle one thing a week, give them one thing a week. Maybe even less than one thing a week, maybe one thing in 2 weeks. And then gradually increase the challenge from that point. So if you don't do that, if you don't have a coaching approach to this, chances are you're going to fail. And I hate to say this, but it's true. So you got to adopt a coaching attitude, not just in franchising, almost in any business. You got to approach it like that if you're dealing with people, and that pertains to people who are just starting out in business, or starting out who are young, perhaps, but also people who are older and much more experienced. You still got to do the same premise. You got to manage their challenge and skill levels, and start at where their challenge and skill levels are, and then build them up from there. The other thing you're going to experience probably are emotional reactions from time to time. And how the mistake that most franchise managers do or owners do when they deal with the franchisees is that they either try to dismiss or ignore their emotional outbursts, or they try to advise and fix it. Both ways don't work, because if you try to resist it, obviously they will just keep, doing whatever they do, which is not much. And if you try to advise them, even if they take your advice, which is rare by the way, even if they take your advice in a timely fashion, now you're training them to always come to you for advice, rather than training them to think for themselves. And that's an important distinction. And in the long term, if you keep it just advising and telling them what to do, you're going to be spending a lot of time in the business, not them. So I want to try and change that around. I hope you get the spirit of this conversation, or communication I'm making with you, in that you want to learn to be more of a coach rather than just a manager. So I hope that makes sense, and I hope you have a wonderful day.